for the next panel. How's everybody doing? Hanging in there? Okay, so this is the most difficult panel of the day with a very, very significant mandate. So it is one that obviously many of us in services, when we move beyond the question of services, say, what is the way forward in the space of narrative? So to address that, short term, medium term, long term, where this has to be dealt with. Changing the narrative, perspectives on migration in the public square. The moderator, Rosalie Wells, who is our new communications manager with a wealth of experience and insight and passion, and also running most of this convening this week. So thank you, Rosalie. I'm going to pass it to you.
Thank you, Mario. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming to our panel, Changing the Narrative, Perspectives on Migration in the Public Square. I hope you're all feeling fired up and invigorated from your speed rounds. And thank you also to all the speakers who led those informative short talks. I'm Rosalie Wells, and I have the privilege and pleasure of working as Communications Manager at the Center for Migration Studies. I'm delighted to be joined today by a panel of experts from across community journalism, narrative change research, Catholic media, and immigrant service and advocacy work to discuss the pressing question of how to change the narrative about immigration today. As we have heard in this convening, and as we have all seen in our own lives this year, the public conversation about immigrants is in a dire place. There is a nativist, ignorant, and markedly cruel story about immigrants that has taken on momentum across this country. That immigrants are violent, criminals, people to be feared. That immigrants are stealing jobs, that they are replacing and weakening American culture and identity. Conspiracy theories and hysteria around migrants has reached a fever pitch. It goes without saying that this story, with all of its logics of racism, xenophobia, and bigotry, must be changed. But this is not the only narrative that the immigrant-serving community needs to think about changing in this difficult moment. There are less extreme, yet still inaccurate and harmful beliefs about migrants that much of the public hold. In the face of mass deportations, many people are asking, why don't undocumented immigrants get in line to legalize? Not knowing that there is no line for most undocumented people to do so in this country. Scared by stories of high levels of global displacement and struggling to make ends meet in their own families, people also ask, do we really have the space and resources to help refugees in this moment? Not grasping how the success and growth of America, both economically, but also culturally and even spiritually, has always rested on the welcoming and integration of the newcomer. So what can we do? The narrative moment we arrive in today is one of change, not stagnation. As mass deportations are picking up in pace, fueled by unprecedented levels of immigration enforcement funding, and more people are being swept up in the morally repugnant and legally dubious machinery of detention, public opinion is in fact changing. And I know that Murad from the New York Immigration Coalition picked up on this in our earlier panel on public policy. So a June Gallup poll found that Americans have grown markedly more positive towards immigration in 2025, with a record high 79% of US adults saying immigration is a good thing for the country, an increase from 64% a year ago, and a high point in the nearly 25-year trend. These numbers are striking. Whilst there is, regrettably, a great deal that cannot be done right now when it comes to changing some policies, these public opinion polls show that we do not have to despair, nor wait to change the conversation on migration. The public is already changing its mind in reaction to the horrors of mass deportation. And transforming the narrative can be done by each and every one of us here today in how we speak about immigration in our media, online, in our churches, in our organizations, and even in conversations between friends, family, and community members. But to do so effectively, we need guidance and we need strategy. And that's why we're so delighted to be joined today by 4 experts whose lives and career offer such valuable insight and ideas for us all to learn from. Adama is a leading voice for immigrant rights. Adama came to New York City at the age of 2, and as a teenager, her whole world changed when the FBI raided her family's apartment in 2005 and were detained for 6 months under baseless charges of terrorism. Following her traumatic experience, Adama chose to speak out and became a nationally famous figure with a book, Accused, an award-winning documentary, Adama, detailing her experience of Islamophobic profiling. Adama is the founder and executive director of her nonprofit, Afrikana, a Harlem-based organization that supports Black, Arab, and Muslim people to navigate the immigration and social benefits system. Afrikana also works to foster common understanding between new arrivals and long-term residents of Harlem and the Bronx. Tim Reidy joined America Media in 2006, a forum for discussion of religion, society, politics, and culture from a Catholic perspective. Tim oversees America's newsroom, directing its daily news coverage, as well as working with the editorial leadership team to plan print issues. And he also edits the magazine's ideas section, as well as having served on the board of directors of Jesuit Refugee Service USA. Shauna Siggelkow is a filmmaker, researcher, and digital strategist. In her current role as the Vice President of Programs at the award-winning immigration narrative change nonprofit, Define American, Shauna and her team explore new applications for emerging technologies for social good, developing and deploying innovative narrative strategies for an evolving media landscape. Through her documentary films, original research, and digital organizing, Shauna's work consistently centers questions around American identity and evolving definitions of citizenship. And last but not least, Ralph Joseph is the Caribbean community correspondent at Documented, the only news media outlet in New York that focuses exclusively on immigrants and the policies that affect them. In this role, he conducts audience research and oversees a news vertical dedicated to Caribbean immigrants living in New York. He connects with the Caribbean audience he covers through various strategies, including on the neighborhood app Nextdoor. Thank you all so much for being part of this discussion today. And if time allows, we are going to open up for questions at the end, although I know we're running a little late, so please have a think now about what you might like to ask our speakers today. But we're going to begin the discussion by asking you to help orient us and remind us of how we got here, because understanding the recent path is what gives us the building blocks to move towards a better future. So please take a few minutes to share your perspective on how we arrived at this moment of inflamed anti-immigrant public conversation. And Shauna, if I can start with you, and then we'll go down the line.
Sure. Hello. First of all, thank you so much, Rosalie, for inviting me to be here, and thank you all so much for your time today, and of course to CMS. So I work at an organization called Define American, and we are a narrative change organization, which means we believe that in order for policy to change on this issue, first we really need to change the conversation that's happening in the culture. And we do that through storytelling. We do that through media. So our work looks like working with filmmakers, TV showrunners, writers, social media influencers, journalists, really anywhere that we see the narrative around immigrant identity in this country being crafted. Those are the industries that we try to partner with and work with. So I've been doing this work for about 10 years. And around 2018, we decided that we needed to really take stock of our approach and our strategy. We had mostly been working in traditional media, so legacy newsrooms and TV and film. And we realized that we didn't really have a clear perspective on digital. So we invested for 3 years in a deep study into anti-immigrant YouTube. And I think it was one of the more valuable research studies that we've done at the organization over the past 13 years. What we found was a very coordinated, cohesive network of anti-immigrant content creators, pushing a very cohesive narrative around the Great Replacement theory. The Great Replacement theory, I'm sure most of the people in this room are unfortunately familiar with this conspiracy theory. It's racist, anti-Semitic, and it posits that the white population in the US is being replaced by immigrants of color. We found this narrative thread in every viral video from the past 15 years, of the top most viewed viral videos on YouTube from the past 15 years. So when we're asking ourselves how we got here, I think that it's really important to take a look at the anti-immigrant media machine that has very purposefully and intentionally built a cohesive narrative for the moment that we're in. And I'll just end by saying, media is really diffuse at this moment. There are many different formats of media that are illustrating and shaping mainstream narratives, but we certainly felt that the digital media space plays a huge role in the moment that we're in right now.
Thank you. It's a great honor for me to be with you today. I'm stressed. So let me start with my experience with Documented. So I work with Documented in Y.com. So I'm the Caribbean community correspondent. I've been doing this job for 3 years here. So I started my job with an audience survey. So at first I had to connect with people, and then to understand the need of my audience, I had to conduct a series of surveys. Because at Documented, we do an audience-centric journalism, and we are community-driven media. So at first, people told me, listen, we are underrepresented in the news media. And every time the media comes to our community, it's about something negative. So we would love to see more positive content about us, because we are not just, we are not criminals. We are doctors, we're nurses, we're deliverers, we're people producing, we're business people. So, and then we have the elections and Donald Trump. And we felt that something was changing because of all the narrative that exists online. And of course, there is a deeper crisis here in the United States, because there is a geopolitical shift, the capitalism crisis. So people are more tied to their identity, and we have the white supremacist group, et cetera, et cetera. So I can say that because you can pick it from my accent. I'm not from here, I'm Haitian. So I'm among the people that Donald Trump labeled as eating dogs and cats. So at the same time, I was doing journalism. So I could feel that, I come from a country where I know when some institutions are dysfunctional, so I can feel how deep the problem is here. So when Trump became president, it was a kind of small crisis I documented, because some of my colleagues, they panicked, because we felt like, okay, at some point we failed in our job. So this is something that is so common to journalists, because in our work, we feel like, oh, we're changing the world, but the world is not changing. Things are getting worse. So we had the kind of crisis meeting, what are we going to do? And the thing is, we're going to brace ourselves, and then we're going to do the work that we are here to do. So reporting the lives of immigrants. So why we are having this conversation here? I think, to me, it's a combination of many crises. Immigration has been something that exists as long as mankind exists, I could say. Immigrants have been in the United States for centuries. But there's a specific moment, I think, which is linked to a kind of economic crisis, and the rise of white supremacy. So I don't want to be deported now, so I'm gonna stay here and pass the word to Adama. Thank you.
You're among allies, so you're okay. For me, how did we get to this moment? August 2022, the first bus arrived from Texas. And the media and the government made it seem like it was very disorganized. But what they didn't tell you is that in every state that was receiving a bus, there were a group of people welcoming them with dignity. And in New York City, I was the one who greeted the first bus. Myself and 5 other women were on the ground, welcoming them with dignity. And we were there from the first bus to the last bus. And we saw the media, we saw the news, we saw the pictures, but they only covered people coming out of the buses. They didn't cover their names. They didn't cover their stories. They didn't tell you how many countries they passed through, who they lost along the way. But most importantly, all you saw on the news were people that were from Venezuela, Peru, Panama. They didn't cover others that were coming They weren't covering Black migrants. They weren't covering the Chinese. They weren't covering the Afghans, the Bengali, and the many others who are arriving. So people felt like, oh no, we only have Venezuelans coming. They didn't see themselves. They didn't understand what was happening. And the fact that we weren't telling the stories of the immigrants that were arriving, that's an issue. The fact that we weren't telling them what their needs were was also another issue. So I remember when we opened our office in Harlem, we're in a community with no fresh fruits and vegetables, nothing. And every day I had a long line of Black immigrants who would come every day asking for help because there was no language access and there were no services for the Black migrants that were coming. And so what I noticed is a lot of residents started coming in angry and upset. And we're like, why are they here? Why are they taking our resources? So what we did is we said, I said, are you done yelling? We can have a conversation. We did a focus group. Went up to deli, got Entenmann's donuts and coffee, and we sat down. I had an old woman sit down with a young man from Mauritania, and I told him, share your story with her. And he told her his story about being a slave. And this woman could not believe it. She's like, my ancestors were slaves. What? And then she kept asking more stories about and trying to understand his journey to America and why he did this. Then we went around the room, we spoke to the Senegalese, we spoke to the Sudanese, the Cameroonian, and each person was telling their story to this community who across the street, their entire building hasn't had heat and hot water, but they were blaming the immigrants. Across the street, they don't have fresh fruits and vegetables. There's evictions. So us having this conversation, the migrants didn't know what eviction was. And they're having this dialogue. So we lack this dialogue between the newcomers and the ones who've been here and don't understand the struggle. Now, I can go on forever about what we did wrong, but what we are doing right is just being in this room and having that conversation now.
Thank you. My name is Tim Reidy. I'm from America Media. Nice to see some of our writers and contributors here today. I come probably from this panel from the most kind of traditional media outlets. So we are a journal of opinion. We've been around 100 years plus, and for a long time, a weekly magazine, but we've transitioned more into the digital space over the last 10 years or so. So we still go around, about the kind of traditional ways of trying to convince people, arguments, op-eds, storytelling, and articles, but we've also branched out into podcast space and doing some videos on YouTube, and also on social media. Now, how did we get here where we are now? I mean, I would say in the Catholic space, we're over the last, I'd say since I've been at the magazine, you're seeing people, and this is reflective of the larger media environment, their media diet is pretty restricted. They're not reading widely. They're not necessarily reading opinions that they disagree with. If they read one newspaper or magazine, that's probably a lot. They're getting a lot of their information, as you were saying, from YouTube and other places like that. So we're slowly trying to get into those spaces, but we're behind. We don't have the same sense of those digital spaces as we do the traditional media. That doesn't mean we can't kind of play in that space, but it's very we're a little behind. But I think another challenge for us, and I think a larger media environment, is like, although we may have many readers among kind of the hierarchy, priests, people who are kind of thought leaders in the Catholic Church, we're still kind of have a small readership of Catholics nationwide. So a lot of these conversations are happening in places that we don't necessarily have access to. We may have readers in this part of the country, but not in other parts of the country. So it's getting into those conversations that's challenging, trying to reach out to people who not just don't know our message, but part of our role is to kind of elevate the message of the thinkers, the bishops, others who are talking about these issues, and how do we help get that message out? And it's harder and harder, and not just on this question, but other questions that the church is concerned with too, because we're kind of a smaller media operation. When you're up against the powers of YouTube or Fox News or MSNBC, whoever's out there, it's offering other narratives. It can be challenging, but doesn't mean there aren't ways, and I'm sure we'll explore that later to kind of fight back on that, but it is a challenge.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I know we are definitely going to be getting into online and digital strategy, all from Shauna. But I also wanted to pick up on a theme that emerged from Ralph and Adama's comments, which is about the gap between an immigrant's lives, their experiences, and the media coverage. A gap, we could also call it a gulf. And it makes me reflect on the fact that one of the ways that many of the public have sort of experienced the horrors of mass deportation through the media has been in the form of following individual stories. So whether that's Mahmoud Khalil or Kilmar Garcia, a lot of coverage has focused on individual people. And Adama, you have the unique experience of knowing what it's like to both share your individual story of mistreatment under the immigration system and really become a figure and face of a political moment. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience and your decision to share your story publicly?
Sure. So I was 16 when I was detained and accused of being a terrorist. And the media and the government wanted to paint me as this monster. Because what was happening post 9/11, they were accusing you of terrorism and then deporting you. But a lot of the people that they deported were really innocent. I think after 9/11, there's about 5 of us that are left that were accused that are still here in the United States. So I had to reclaim my story. I had to say, no, I'm not that monster. I'm into boy band groups. I can show you all the dance moves. But if I didn't do that, they would have just kept this narrative of these are bad. This is what the bad immigrant looks like. And if I didn't do that, I wouldn't have my citizenship today. It took me 16 years to become an American citizen, back and forth in court. But I'm glad, but I'm using this story as to say, listen, the same laws that they used to put me in handcuffs and shackles and ankle bracelet is the same law I'm using to free myself. So let me teach you how to do that. We cannot fight this with hate. We just have to continue to educate. We have to educate people who are ignorant, and we have to educate people who don't want to listen to us. And when I tell a lot of the people that I'm an immigrant, they're kind of shocked. I'm like, well, you don't look like one, or you speak English. I didn't expect that. Or that's where you're from. But it's okay. Let them say those comments so you can digest the conversation and continue going. But I can tell you, because of my experience, I've been able to help the asylum seekers. I've been able to gain their trust because I said, I already been through this process. You can make it. Just breathe and let's do this together.
Thank you so much for sharing, and leads us nicely on to Ralph. You spoke about when you first started doing research with Documented, learning about this need of the needs of the immigration community not being met with coverage. Could you share with us a bit about the reporting strategy you use to meet that need and to tell more humanizing stories about immigrants in New York City?
Well, so I'm going to talk about Documented, in large, because what I'm doing is just one segment of what Documented is doing. So the way we work, Documented, we have many community correspondents. So I'm covering the Caribbean community. So I have my colleague Peril covering the Chinese community, and I have my other colleague Romel covering the Latino community. So each of us, we are working on different projects. We are responsible of what we call a news vertical. So me, I publish content in Haitian Creole, sometimes in French and in English. And my colleague Romel does the same in Spanish and in English, and my colleague April does the same in Chinese. So we reach out to our respective audience through different channels. For instance, my colleague April covering the Chinese community is on WeChat. And my colleague Romel has over 2,000 Latino immigrants on WhatsApp. And then me, from my audience survey, I learned that people, they stay connected with their community through Nextdoor. And I'm on Nextdoor. That's why I'm on Nextdoor. And this is a pretty interesting experience, because when I first started on Nextdoor, I realized that it's a platform which is a kind of news desert, because people were talking mostly about dogs and cats. Sometimes people, they're looking for a carpenter, something happened in the neighborhood, a theft, something like that. And when I first started pushing news content, I was like, people were like very conservative, oh, those immigrants, they're coming to steal jobs. They're living a lavish lifestyle in hotels in New York. They're having money. And, under my post, there were many comparisons with veterans, etc. So I felt like, it was, I think Nextdoor is still a pretty conservative, but I realized that over time, after about 3 years, there is a shift because I'm that kind of person in my neighborhood where people, they could have access to a different kind of narrative. Because many of the content I produce for Documented, they're based on the feedback I receive on Nextdoor and other platforms. So, for example, when I saw there was a heated conversation below one of my posts about the advantage immigrants had here in New York, I was able to produce, a guide explaining, what do exactly immigrant gets once they arrive to the United States. So all of this is to tell you that we are doing that kind of audience-centric journalism because there's one thing when covering immigration. Most of the time when we think about immigrant, we don't think about the newly arrived asylum seekers. Why? Because most of the time they speak different languages. We don't know where to find them. So we were able to have over 2,000 people on WhatsApp because we reach out for months and years to the Latino communities. And one person come with 5 others, and we grew up that community there. And there we can tap on that community to let them know, listen, is there something happening? And someone may respond, listen, there's an ICE raid happening here. And our community correspondent knows that, part of the coverage will be about this. It's the same. We produce a lot of resource guides. How do we know what type of guides to produce? It's based on the needs of the newly arrived immigrants, for example. But there is not only that. We have people who have been established here for a long time. People like Adama. My colleague Fisayo wrote a nice piece about her. We must serve this specific group of people also. And from my own experience covering Caribbean people, I realized that most of the time, when we talk about immigrants, we don't think about young people, especially the people who go to college, they're experiencing a different type of situation. The stress, the fact, of having the first steps in a complete different system. Even me, before coming to the United States, I launched my news media. I was editor-in-chief. Working here is not an easy job for me. So you can imagine from someone from West Africa, from Senegal, someone from, Turkey and Caicos, stepping here, in the mid of the year in US school where they're bullied, how do we reach out to these people? What kind of resources they're looking for? So the job that we're doing at Documented is permanently having a two-way conversation with community leaders, with organizations, with immigrant groups, so we know what type of content they're looking for and how we can produce this content so they can resonate to that specific audience.
It's so interesting to hear about, and I love that idea of going out, researching, and then strategizing responsive communications that actually meets the needs. And it does make me think also of Shauna's work. So Shauna, I would love to hear a bit from you about your research into sort of moving the middle, and hear a little bit about how Define American reaches new online spaces with your messaging.
Certainly. Well, it's so interesting when you think about the current media landscape and how different issue areas kind of approach it. So we know writ large that the conservative, the far right movement in this country tends to work in networked ecosystems on social media. While when you look at kind of the more progressive nonprofit space, we tend to do kind of one-off hashtag campaigns. So there's a call to action, there's a specific policy or petition that we're trying to push. This can be very effective, and we've done plenty campaigns at Define American. But when we studied the other side, we saw that what they were doing with their model was more sustainable. When you have an ecosystem of content creators who are pushing narratives and content weekly or monthly on their channels that are becoming more and more popular, what you're able to do is create a more cohesive narrative. So we looked at the immigrant rights space and we thought, how can we contribute something that's a little bit more networked and more from the lens of an ecosystem advocacy in the digital space. So a couple years ago, we were approached by the Tides Foundation with an opportunity to facilitate a community of practice. So the Immigrants Belong Community of Narrative Practice is a coalition of 10 immigrant rights organizations from around the country. They all have different areas of focus. None of them are primarily narrative change organizations. They do mostly grassroots work. But they all had the goal of doing narrative change work and specifically of reaching people who were not already in our choir. So for a long time at Define American even, my background's production. So I was producing a lot of short form documentaries and pieces for social. And I was pretty much making content that I wanted to watch. And I think that that is a pretty natural direction to go as an artist or a creator. But I'm not trying to talk to people like me. One of my favorite statistics is if you wanted to know if someone voted for Donald Trump in 2016, the best piece of data you could get wasn't whether they voted for Bush or even if they're in a red district. It's whether or not they watched Duck Dynasty. So how do we reach Duck Dynasty? It's a TV show. It's a reality TV show. I don't watch Duck Dynasty. I also didn't vote for Trump. But I did try watching Duck Dynasty. I did. I was like, I got to figure out how to talk to these people. And I did, the color palette was different from what I watched, the editing style, even the way the camera was held. And the subject matter, certainly, I'm not very interested in ducks. But what we realized collectively at Define American is we need to be interested in ducks. We need to figure out how to produce content that visually and values-wise speaks to audiences that are not part of our base. So we worked with a group called Harmony Labs. They're a research organization to understand who in this country is movable on immigration. We call them the movable middle. And after 3 years of studying, we produced a report that's on our website. It's called Move Them or Lose Them. And it profiles the media diets of people in this country who are movable on this issue. And our strategy is to try to reach them where they are. So we don't have a partnership with Duck Dynasty, but we are trying to work with content creators on social media who are essentially the equivalent. And we've worked with influencers across many different genres, food influencers, explainer videos, evangelical Christian influencers. We had a great video about interfaith dialogue between a Muslim influencer and an evangelical Christian influencer talking about the shared value of welcoming. And that lived on her channel, which when we looked at the analytics, way outside of our normal base for the immigrant rights movement. So we're bringing this strategy, this research, these data points to this community of practice. And we've built toolkits and resources for other organizations that are looking to speak to people outside of the choir on digital. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Your research, Shauna, on moving the middle, it makes me think a lot about the conversations we were having earlier today about how many people in the Catholic space actually occupy that, and how, obviously everyone here is pretty enthusiastic about immigration, but there is, these much broader Catholic networks, communities where we want to reach and to engage them. And this seems in a lot of ways like an opportune moment to do so. So I would love to hear from you, Tim, firstly, how American media has sort of been approaching, engaging with people and reporting, commenting on mass deportation and harsh immigration policies, but also if you'd like sort of your broader reflections on the Catholic Church and how it can reach more people on this issue.
Sure. As I said before, we our bread and butter is kind of the traditional way of doing journalism in terms of like publishing op-eds or editorials or reporting out stories, telling stories, I think really helps. But we know that's not enough. So how do we continue to try to kind of change the narrative and to kind of reach people who are in the middle? And a few ways we've done that. I mean, I think one is to kind of model a conversation. So if we can find people, even if they're not diametrically opposed to maybe where we stand editorially, but might disagree with on some points, bring them onto a podcast, which we're putting it on YouTube as well now, and try to model the kinds of conversations, charitable conversations with people who may disagree on some of these questions. So that's one way we could do it. We also, obviously there are people, very prominent Catholics, like the Vice President, for example, who have a certain point of view and narrative on this question. So how do we, we'd love to interview him. I'm not sure if that's going to happen soon, but how do we engage with those big kind of influencers, people who are really shifting the conversation and, kind of in some ways dominating the conversation. So that's one way to look at it. But also, I mean, we know that where we can, now this is maybe a little bit outside of our wheelhouse as a media organization, but how do we conduct or sponsor in-person events or conversations? Speaking to a colleague of mine, we did a few of these a few years ago around questions of immigration, doing it in parishes and schools kind of outside of our normal, maybe Northeast corridor, and getting people, because I think the parish is a space where some of these conversations can happen, because we know that certainly there's a diversity of opinion within a parish community, but I also think there's obviously things people share there. So I think if you can get people in a room at that level to have these conversations, I think they can be really effective. So it's something I think we can help with a little bit as a media organization, going out and interviewing people in public, inviting people for conversations around these questions at schools. Again, getting out of our normal the normal places where we tend to go. It's great that we have a lot of connections at Jesuit schools in the Northeast, et cetera, but we need to go to the Midwest. We need to go to Phoenix. We need to go to places out west to go to get this message out. So all these things can help, but trying to model conversation, digitally, but also in person when that's possible.
Completely. And I think that point of modeling conversation and overcoming disagreement makes me think a lot about Adama's work. I know that's a really key element of Afrikana and what you've been doing the last few years. And you did touch on it a little bit earlier, but I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit more about how you do set up those conversations with the goal of sort of fostering inter-community solidarity between immigrants or other groups.
It's a hard job because you have to deal with people who are worried about where they can park their Mercedes from a person who doesn't have one. And how do you get them all in the room to volunteer? And so I always tell them, come to my office. Do you speak French, or what language do you speak? And I have them meet asylum seekers or immigrants and help. One of the groups that I work with are the women who are knitting out there, who I've worked with since COVID. So when you guys finish, please support them. We've been working together since COVID, and they are mostly from Mexico, Ecuador, and Peru. But the fact that we are working together changes the conversation. Me understanding what their community is going through and them understanding what my community is going through. They don't understand the struggles that I have or have never experienced the struggles that I have, and I've never experienced a lot of their struggles. So for us to do that and bring other people in that conversation is how you do it. We partner here with Kevin, who has Jesuit students, and they come to our office and they volunteer. One of the best ways to have us to change the narrative is have people volunteer at these spaces. Because when they're at a soup kitchen, or when they're feeding the homeless, or when they're feeding a victim who just lost their house, it changes the conversation. Several years ago, we had a fire in the Bronx that took 17 lives. And I was on the ground the entire time because the city did not know the immigrant community that lived there were Gambians, and their language very different. But some of them spoke Pular, and I spoke Pular. So we were there interpreting, and what we were doing was sharing with the stories to others who didn't understand what happened. How come he didn't close their door? How come they didn't leave? But there's no fire safety information in their languages. No one has ever thought about giving them fire safety education. And these are people who've been in this country for years. And so it started a conversation, how do we tap into immigrant communities that we normally never tap into? Who in here has heard of the language called Jula? Who in here heard of a language, Bambara? Soninke. These are languages that are new to the United States, but they're not new to me and my family. They're not new to a lot of the people that we serve, and they're here in this country. And if we don't tap into people and have them part of this conversation, it's going to be difficult. But have them volunteer. I'm telling you, it changes people's feelings and how they tackle the situations moving forward.
Thank you so much for sharing. And one of the topics I also want us to touch on was about the challenge of the current narrative, sort of othering immigrants as separate and different from American society in a way that encourages fear and stereotyping. But more than that, also mischaracterizes America. It mischaracterizes New York City, places that were really built on immigration and that thrive because of the diversity of background, culture, and language, and not in spite of it. So I wanted to start by asking Shauna, how does Define American think about building and communicating a multiracial immigrant American identity that is inclusive?
Yeah, I think Adama spoke to this a little bit earlier. So Define American was founded in 2013 by Jose Antonio Vargas, who is an undocumented Pulitzer Prize winning Filipino man, which already bucks a lot of stereotypes. We have always really committed to telling a plural story when we have any representations of immigrants in our either what we produce or what we consult on. So I think that just talking about immigration as a very diverse issue is already really combating a lot of mis and disinformation out there. It very much serves the other side to make this a very simple black and white issue. Using the I word and the threat of invasion. This is really simple messaging, and it's very fear-based, when the truth is it's actually quite complicated. You can fall out of status for a multitude of reasons. It's not a black and white simple system. So we are always trying to encourage nuance and complexity in the storytelling. And it also, what we found, especially working with TV showrunners or writers, it's a way better story. I mean, we consulted on a show that was on NBC for a while called Superstore, and had a character named Mateo. We consulted on that character. He was also an undocumented Filipino man, which is just a coincidence with our founder's identity. Sorry? Yes, they did. Yeah. We consulted on that episode as well. And within the first couple weeks, they were like, okay, we've done this storyline. We want to make him legal now. And we were like, how? Are you going to pass immigration reform? So that led to, I think it was 8-season arc, where his immigration status kept coming up. And we brought undocumented folks into the writer's room to share personal anecdotes, many of which made it into scripts. So there are, I think the last estimate was 14 million undocumented folks in this country. That's 14 million stories. And they're rich. And if we highlight the differences and the complexities in them, can really help humanize and shift the narrative.
Yeah, completely. And on that point of kind of humanizing and shifting the narrative, I was also wondering if we could hear a bit more from Tim about some examples you've seen of leadership, whether immigrant leadership or allyship within the Catholic Church and activism space at the moment that you think is effectively changing the narrative.
Yeah, we spoke a bit about this on our call, but I think sometimes, I think people, even though they may have a limited media diet, they're just overwhelmed by information. And, so it can be hard to kind of break through the noise when you're trying to talk about this topic. So sometimes that's something we think a lot about, like, how do you reach people? How do you say something that people can really hear? And I think this is something the leaders in the Catholic Church are also thinking about. And I think we were, for example, the witness of some of the bishops who have attended the immigration hearings. Maybe this is something you spoke about earlier, but this happened in San Diego with the bishop there. I mean, I think just that witness, there wasn't a lot to that other than just being there, but I think that kind of broke through in a way, at least for our audience. So sometimes it isn't publishing another article or, but it is just highlighting this in some way. So that's very effective. I think certainly we saw that with Pope Francis and his ability to use imagery, to use encounter as a way to kind of break through and direct people's attention to these stories. So it's something we can't always orchestrate ourselves, but it is something when we see it happening, I think we can jump in and try to shine a light on it.
No, totally. And I think what you've highlighted there is actually it's been actions really
Right.
that have really struck through with Bishop Pham. And also words, people have been really moved by Pope Leo's words on migration so far. But if I could ask you a slightly more probing question, do you think that there is space to do more within the Catholic community in this?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think you will see that. My sense is that, I mean, obviously we're all still getting a sense of Pope Leo, but, in some of the appointments he's making, I think we have a bishop who was just named in Newark who is not American born, I think from maybe Nicaragua. But I think you're going to start to see more leadership within the church coming from these places, truly reflective of this country. And I think that's also in line with who Pope Leo is. So I think that will change when you start to see people from these communities leading. That will also change the conversation.
And I want to spend just a little bit more time in New York, given that we are here at a great New York university and have many New Yorkers here. So again, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about in the run up to this panel is about the period that Adama has been talking about this kind of real polarization, difficult moment for rhetoric and the conversation about immigrants in New York. And I was wondering, Adama, as someone who was very much frontline, front of the queue, first to the buses, what do you think is missing about the conversation about immigration in New York? And that could be across, in the media, but also actually, just within the chattering class, the policymakers.
Wow, there's a lot of things, but first thing I would point out was language access, because I think a lot of people that assumed we just needed this Spanish only. We needed different languages. And then including immigrants who've been here for years, who are naturalized into the conversation, was also missing. What we realized that a lot of people that voted for Trump were naturalized citizens who've been here for centuries, who are out of touch with where they came from and how they even got here. And in the African community, what we did is we said, let's tap into them to interpret or translate for us. So what we did is we asked uncles who've been here for years, that's what we call them, uncles and aunties, and we asked them to interpret, for example, Mauritania Pulat is very different from Pulat in Guinea. And we would ask them to interpret for a case or for something. And you have to see the faces of the uncles like, whoa, I haven't spoken that in years. And they would come out. We would ask our uncles who spoke Twi, Mori, and there's so many languages. Even Eritrea, I didn't even know what language they spoke there. So to have people come in those communities who were like, well, we never went that way. We didn't go through the border. We didn't go through 8 countries. We wanted them to interpret, because I want you to hear the stories of how they got here and why they left. And I remember listening to one conversation of a Mauritanian guy who was talking to actually my uncle about his childhood and the village. And my uncle was like, oh, I remember that. Is the ice cream guy still there? And them just bonding over that conversation. But I think the biggest missing piece is there were immigrants who have left their countries years and years ago, and it's not the same anymore. And they had made a life for themselves here, and they forgot what that struggle was. I myself had the honor of being an American citizen. I don't want to be the last one. I want to make sure others get a chance to have a status or a chance to be in this country. So definitely we need to include more people who were once immigrants themselves.
Thank you so much for sharing. And it feels like a theme we are kind of circling around here is sort of political education and media literacy. And I wanted to ask, Ralph, what have you observed in your community reporting on the ground about political and media literacy, and what do you think could be done to improve it, whether from Documented's work or other avenues?
Yeah, there is a lot. Let me start with my experience on Nextdoor. I'm amazed to see how people spend time to fact check other people who comment under my posts on Nextdoor.
Yeah.
And when I say fact check, I realize that there are people who are criticizing immigrants. It's not because they want to, it's because they are misinformed, or I don't know, they don't have any kind of reliable source of information, so they trust the first thing they see. And as we know, people are flooded with, fake news, all sort of content on social media. So the first thing they get is, these people, they come here and they cost the city, I don't know, $2 billion. But let me give you an example. I come from a country of about 12 million people. The annual budget is less than $3 billion for 12 million people. So when I look at a couple things about, the federal spending, I don't want to go very deep into this, but, I know that $3 billion is nothing for the United States. It's a lot of money, but when you look at the United States, it's a lot. But me, I am a reporter who is going into the details, to see the spending for immigrants compared to their contribution in terms of taxes. So how much, immigrant living under temporary protected status are paying, how much undocumented immigrants are paying in terms of taxes. So at first, when people on Nextdoor say, oh, these people, they're coming to New York and the city is just giving them money. But I'm amazed to see how other people on Nextdoor go into long detail to let people know, listen, you are misinformed. Here's the truth. And they go paragraph. I used to have long paragraphs under my post to see how people have a kind of counter narrative to inform people about the reality of immigration. So the thing is, of course, people are flooded with information, but there are other people who must decide what kind of information we must leave to dominate the narrative. So I think, based on my experience, the more we put fact on the table, the more we can have people question their assumptions. That's why I think content production is really important. That's why I believe that journalism in all form, podcasts, video, infographics, you name it, is really important. And Adama mentioned language barrier. I have extensive experience with immigrants from the Caribbean, especially Haitian immigrants who don't speak English. And the fact that I speak English, or even when I meet West Africans, for instance, I'm working on a very sensitive case with a Guinean immigrant. So it was so easy for me to convince him, because I was like, we were speaking French. I was like, I was in your country in December. So this is my experience. And suddenly that person is open. And I realized that these people, they come to this country, they don't understand anything about the system and they're left behind. So language access is really important. That's why Documented is producing content in 4 different languages, which is far from being enough, but I think it's the first step, producing content in different languages and producing the narrative about the reality of immigration is crucial, because there are so many people outside. They have a certain point of view about immigration is because they don't have access to the correct information.
Thank you for sharing. And, as a think tank, the Center for Migration Studies is also very much trying to, make progress in that area, because you're right that beyond also just immigrant communities, really across many American communities, there is a very fundamental lack of misunderstanding, for example, on the undocumented, tax subject of undocumented people pay their taxes, they don't get the benefits through. And so the net contribution is actually totally staggering. And it's like basically an economic win for the US tax revenue. And people just don't know that. I think I actually recently saw some content of kind of people in the street telling people that fact for the first time, and it really taking them by surprise.
Yes, and I would love to add one last thing. The power of storytelling. So we were talking about 14 million immigrants. So each of them are a different story. So I think this is really important, especially when we know how people are cut when it comes to let's say the guy selling jerk chicken in a corner of Brooklyn, downtown Brooklyn. So we jump off the bus and or we're in the car, we see the guy, but the more the media can go to that person and have that story and let other people read that story. Why did you come here? You know, this is a question even me I've been asking myself, because my goal was I came here, I came to NYU. After 2 years, I had to leave that country. In the meantime, they killed the president in Haiti. The gang took control of the country, and I was no longer able to go back to my country. But I am trying to adapt here. I'm learning the codes. I am one story, but I am a person producing other stories. So when we focus on storytelling, when we bring the underrepresented voices to the table, to the media, it's a way to inform people about these other people they used to look afar and bring these stories closer to them. Therefore, they can have a kind of shift of the way they see immigration and immigrant.
Thank you. That was really beautifully put. And I would love to leave time for some questions at the end. So I'll move on to our last panel question for all of you. This has been really such an insightful discussion. And while the weight of what is to be done to change the narrative on migration is certainly heavy, I feel very guided by the wisdom of what we've heard from our panelists today. So thank you. And I'd like to close the panel question part of this conversation by asking you all to share one thing that gives you hope that the narrative on immigration and immigrants can be changed. And if you so wish, you could also share a piece of advice with the audience for making that change. We could start with Shauna again and go down the line.
I have two things, but I'll be quick. The first is that things are changing very quickly. You know, I look to the digital space, and I do think that the anti-immigrant movement has been able to leverage new media more effectively in the short term. But Obama won in 2008 because the Democrats were better at social back then. I think that power dynamics on social media shift very quickly. And there's a lot of opportunity for us to leverage digital better. And then the second thing is, I think we have a better story. I think the other side's vision of the future of this country, rooted in the Great Replacement theory that we found across our research, it's really bleak and negative, based in fear and scarcity. If we can push more stories that celebrate pluralism and the contributions of immigrant communities in this country, I just think we have a better story. And please look at our resources at defineamerican.com if you're interested in storytelling resources.
Well, what gives me hope is people like you, because of course you could see that I was a bit nervous in the beginning because of all these pairs of eyes toward me. So it's an interest about what, you know, it's on the table. We're talking about immigration. So it's my day-to-day work to be in touch with people like you, with organizations, with other media leaders. So what gives me hope is people like you who are still interested about talking about this, who pay a close attention to it, number one. Number two is the organization I'm in touch with, because most of the time people don't understand the amount of work people are doing on the ground assisting immigrants and how hard it would be if these people didn't exist. So I think these type of people I'm interacting with on a daily basis give me hope. And the other thing that give me hope is my colleague and the work that we're doing at Documented. I can see the amount of dedication of my colleague, the way that, you know, at Documented people are working to make things, you know, to make people understand, you know, the basic things. Sometimes, you know, people like you may say, okay, this guide is useless, but when we write a guide for a person who first arrived here, it's a lot of information for that person. So all these things give me hope. So we're keeping doing the job. It's a commitment I documented, and I invite you all to subscribe to our newsletter to see the kind of work we're producing. We rely a lot on feedback. Whenever you have a feedback, don't hesitate to send an email. We have an impact tracker. If you send an email, the newsroom will know that this person is not happy with what we publish, or that person said that we should publish something in that direction. So guys, you are among the people who give me hope.
I know you said one, but I think one of the things are the filmmakers. Nat is here, and he actually followed me at Port Authority Welcoming. And there's another documentary called Arrivals. And those two documentaries, it is brave to follow us at a time when the city was literally threatening to take us to court for welcoming. So I thank you for your bravery, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for people like Kevin, who make sure my office always has Jesuit students who speak French and Spanish. But I'm grateful for the partnership. You cannot do this work alone. You're gonna get burnt out. I'm grateful for the interfaith. I'm grateful for my synagogue coalitions, my interfaith coalitions, because as a one woman, my voice is off. As a Black woman, my voice is always drowned. But when I have angry white women from the churches yelling at the city, it helps. When I have my angry Jewish woman yelling at an elected official, it helps and it makes me feel good. So I am grateful for them. I'm grateful for them for believing in me and supporting me. And I thank you all for being here. And this work is not easy, and we have a long road ahead of us, but we're not going to do it alone.
If I could put my hat on from Jesuit Refugee Services for a moment, I think one kind of thing I took out of that experience, it's sort of in the board for almost 10 years, is like, it may feel like a very polarizing topic now, but historically, that organization, it was pretty bipartisan in the support that it got from both sides of the aisle in terms of, reaching out to refugees, placing refugees. It became a very heated question over the last 2 years, but I think that is still true. I think there's still people from both sides of the aisle who recognize that this is very much part of the American story. And I think those people are still out there. So I think it's still hopeful. One of the videos we did in America that was very popular was a Republican family who took in a refugee from Afghanistan and settled them in their home and continue to do so. So like telling those stories and just say, okay, this is not a partisan topic. These are people who value this, the immigrant experience is very important. So I think those stories are still out there and there'll be time to tell them.
Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing those very uplifting thoughts and sentiments. We do have time for a few questions, if people have any. And do we have a mic runner? Because I've been doing it so far. Okay, thank you, Elena.
Hi. One thing I struggle with is I'm from my family came from Ireland, about 100 years ago. And it's so the cognitive dissonance is what gets me. It's how even my uncle is the first one to say, well, these people are different because they're not hardworking and, whatever excuse they have. And it's like, well, they were saying the same thing about you, 100 years ago. Like, how do you create a story that, we talked a lot about today about personal connection, but even more closely that like, it just blows my mind how people forget where they came from, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Does anyone want to take this?
I can
So I think there's a post from Robert Rich, an economist. When ICE was raiding workplaces, he said that if these people are criminals or gangsters, why ICE is going after them in workplaces? Which is a pretty relevant question. So if these people are not hardworking people, why ICE is going after them in workplaces, in farms, etc.? So I think to answer your question, on a journalist perspective, we can combat this through storytelling. And one of the reasons why people told me during my audience research that they need more positive stories about them, they didn't ask for glossy inventions. They asked me, listen, we are nurses. We died during COVID-19 to take care of people in this city. Of course, we may have crime in our neighborhood, but we need to see ourselves represented in the media as nurses, as doctors, as delivery workers. So I think if we start framing the immigrants for what they are in terms of what they're bringing to the different communities, we can help people have a different view of these people. Because the bias is created through misinformation, I think we can combat bias through information. And we can still remain with truth by telling the correct stories, because all these people, each person is a story, and every person is struggling to make something happen for their family, for themselves, and for the community. Storytelling is really powerful.
Yeah, I had a quick question. First of all, thanks to the panel. It was very powerful. It was a great panel. I'm sure you're familiar with this ProPublica study on kind of President Trump and his public life and how many times he's used certain words and certain expressions, snakes and everything that he's called people. And he's done it for, years and years, decades really, including over the 2 presidential runs. And we've been in it seems like we've been in a lot of conversations for a lot of years on nuanced, complex, accurate, person-centered type of language, with the right messengers saying the right things. And yet, like when I turn on the news, I hear this like simple, over and over, basically one crude, scandalous untruth after the next, repeated in lockstep, I mean, and I just wanted to get your all sense of that, because I feel like it's not that we're losing the messaging war, it's just we're getting drowned out. And what do you do about that when you have kind of the president of the United States and a political party that's actually, echoing him at every step. And it's the same stuff over and over and over again. None of it, all built on falsehoods, I think, So I just wanted to ask you.
I mean, from a media perspective, I think one of the things we try to do, if there's a moment where we find that like, okay, maybe the president or somebody else has said something that we feel like we can engage with in some way. Like, for example, he said recently, like he would like to go to heaven. I don't know if people remember this. But that was something where we took that, my colleague who was here earlier, Father Martin, took that seriously and responded to it in a way, as a priest. Okay, this is how I would respond. And I think that article got a lot of attention because it's like it took a moment where that was in the news and tried to really answer it. And it's not always easy to find those moments, and it's not always easy to figure out what the right tone is in those moments. But every so often you get those, at least from our perspective, opportunity to say, okay, we might be able to break through here. And we try to do that.
Yeah, I'd love to answer as well. So we can talk about strategy, we can do message testing, we can have great coalitions, and I don't want to be negative because this has been a really positive conversation, but there's the reality of funding too. When you look at the other side, if you're familiar with something called the Tantan Network, they've been building an anti-immigrant media machine since the 70s, and it's incredibly well funded. It's cohesive and it's organized. Tantan Network, New York Times wrote about it. You can look it up if you're not familiar, but PragerU, which stands for Prager University, which is a far-right propaganda YouTube channel, had a budget of $70 million this year. And Trump recently said he might want to replace PBS with it. And it has curriculums that are being taught in public schools. So I wouldn't necessarily focus just on the strategy. It's also the size of what we're up against. But that's not to say that we don't have good strategies and that with time we can build our own infrastructure to combat what has been built. But we have to acknowledge that they've been working on this project for decades.
Hi. So I started the conversation talking about polling and how the numbers have turned around. And one thing that I've noticed about polling over the time in the immigration sector is that it really depends how the question is asked. And so I'll see two polls, one after the other, with the question asked slightly different, but getting at the same concept, and it just goes opposite directions. And I found the same on the occasions when the media reaches out to our organization. It's how they ask the question that, and I know there's training to be able to know how to like reframe when you're talking to journalists, but just how do you work with trying to respond to media when the questions being asked in the first place don't lend themselves to telling a good story?
That is a good question. I'm happy to share a bit of my thoughts as the communications manager at the Center for Migration Studies. I very much hear that. We have observed, even just this year, some journalists, naming no names, we've worked with for years, suddenly using different language, different terms, different value frames to talk about the issue. And that is really frustrating, and it can be difficult to reorientate yourself. But I think your point on polling makes me think a lot about this topic that's come up a few times in the convening about encounter and about community networks. So when I have heard from journalists of where they've seen the biggest shifts in local communities has been a story that's now becoming quite familiar of, oh, actually, this person I knew who lived down the street from me, this person I knew who worked in my bodega has now been detained. That seems to be really one of the moments where the conversation goes back to being compassionate, it goes back to being curious, and it seems to be able to sort of shift to that point of encounter. And it seems to be a place where, again, public opinion, and again, your point on polls is very well taken, is actually shifting. That's not a total answer to your question, but I think it's like one of the areas that has given me hope as a comms person in this area at the moment. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add.
I don't know if I can answer as a journalist, but there is one thing I don't like. I won't say I hate, is whenever I contact an organization and I have two PR people on the call, recording everything and then asking me to submit, the quotes before publication. So I can tell I didn't work for big news organization here in the United States for documented back in my experience back in Haiti when I was creating content. So I launched a news platform. I had the free will to decide, how to orient my production. But from what I understand here, especially in big news organization, when you have a reporter contacting you, sometimes that person pitch a story and his initial pitch is so transformed that the person becomes a kind of industrial producer. The reporter is just working just to make a living, but the reporter is not making news based on what he or she thinks that is the best way to approach a situation. So it's a difficult question to answer because it's based on media policy. It's based on the place where the reporter works. Does the reporter have freedom to decide where to go with a story and what type of editorial content the media want to push? So it's not an easy one, but I don't know. It depends it varies from media to media. And I understand that, many established media, especially we know that, there are left wing or right wing, middle wing media. So it depends on all these factors. So it's not an easy question to answer.
I think we have time for one more quick question.
Thank you. Carmen Maquilon from Catholic Charities, Long Island. And this is a follow-up to the previous question. And it's how much influence do you get from your editors to say, and how much does your story has to switch in order to, one, save your job, save the agency that you work for? Because I noticed that on, like the Washington Post just fired the last Black woman that they had because she came out and say something, right? Cannot say that. So it makes you lose trust in what you read. You don't know what else or who else to believe, because it is obvious that journalists are no longer allowed to say what they are supposed to do or what they are supposed to. The message gets twisted.
Well, it's certainly a tumultuous time in media. I mean, the Post is owned obviously by Jeff Bezos, and he took a different, the op-ed page in a different direction. So maybe that's some of what you're referring to. But yeah, I mean, the media ownership of CBS News now is under question. So like, there's a lot of changes happening in the industry, and like that argues for more homework as a viewer, as a consumer of news in terms of where you choose. But we're going to see some changes in PBS and NPR too. So buckle up. But some of this is not over with. But I think hopefully there's still small media outlets out there that you can trust, and I encourage you to look for those.
Yeah, and based from my experience in a small news media, I can tell you that the relationship between a reporter and their editor is more organic. For example, before coming here, I had a pitch meeting this morning. We pitch stories and we explain why the angle is really important. And we decide of the importance based on the feedback we have from the community, as I said, on the different channel where we receive questions, requests, etc. So as soon as we tell our editor, listen, I pitched that story based on a question I received on Nextdoor or my colleague from WeChat or on WhatsApp, they are very open to say, listen, this is exactly what the audience need to understand from this. And I think there is a reason, I mean, I can understand why people don't trust the media. I remember when I was in a journalism class at NYU, there were a heated debate about, trust in the media. And I was like with the professor and all the students, I asked the question, do you trust the media? And there was a big silence. Even the professor couldn't say, yes, I trust the media. And my point was like, because we were pretty much mid-career journalists, and we were like, even us as journalists, we cannot say that we trust the media because it's not a unified, can I say unified ecosystem? You have so many media, so many declination. When we talk about the media, that I can understand why people don't trust the media. But as Tim said, there are small news organizations there who have a more organic relationship, a more close, they are closer to, I mean, they need to bring truth, they call themselves alternative media. I think that people still can trust these outlets.
Thank you so much. And I really would genuinely also say that, having speakers from documented in American media is one of the things that gives me so much hope at the moment. There are news organizations that are doing such interesting things, community-based work, values-based reporting, and I think following publications like theirs is a really great way to vary your media diet at the moment when you're right, there's a lot of mistrust. So thank you so much to our panelists. Give them a round of applause.